It's the middle of the night in Louie and Peach's Owen Hart Hospital in Tyler, Texas. The steady hum of machines fills the air, heart monitors beep rhythmically, a soft reassurance that the patients here, recovering from complex heart surgeries, that they're alive and stable. In the cardiovascular intensive care unit, also known as the CVICU, highly skilled nurses make rounds. Their eyes are scanning monitors, IV lines, and respirators for any sign of change. On multiple occasions, patients would be laying in their hospital beds, just sleeping. They all have normal vital signs, and in just a few minutes, they suddenly decline. The nurses were just in their patients' rooms, and they were fine. Now, their vitals are crashing, the heart is slowing down, blood pressure is dropping, and they're unconscious. All of these patients have the same neurological incidents that no one can explain until it's too late. It turns out a hospital is the perfect place for a serial killer to hide. Registered nurse William George Davis would murder and severely injure approximately 10 or more people from 2016 to January 2018. Some of the surviving victims would end up enduring lifelong complications. Before we begin today's episode, the story I'm covering involves graphic details about medical malpractice, patient deaths, and disturbing acts of violence. Some listeners may find the content upsetting, especially those sensitive to discussions of medical trauma and murder. So please take care of yourself while listening and skip this episode if you need to. Our goal is to tell these stories with respect for the victims and their families. But before we dive in, I'd like to highlight a cause. In the wake of Hurricane Helene, many communities have been severely impacted and are in need of support. All Hands and Hearts, a disaster relief organization, helps to rebuild schools, homes, and other infrastructure in devastated communities. If you would like to consider donating to help those affected by this disaster, you can find more information at allhandsandhearts.org. Now, with that in mind, let's begin. It was supposed to be a place of healing, the Christus Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler, Texas, had a stellar reputation for saving lives. In this bustling hospital, patients and their families trusted that they were in good hands. The nurses, doctors, and staff worked tirelessly, moving through their shifts with precision and care like you would expect from a top medical facility. Families from all over the area brought their loved ones there, confident they'd receive top-tier medical attention. It was known for handling complex heart surgeries, and for many patients, it was their lifeline. The CVICU is where people go to recover from their heart surgeries. Nurses who work on this unit specialize in care of critically ill with heart and vascular problems. The nurses, they have to be calm under pressure, navigate and communicate stressful situations well. Things change in the blink of an eye. Nurses adapting to ever-changing needs of complex patients is an absolute must. It's said to be one of the most challenging types of nursing due to complex patients, technology, treatments, and procedures. William George Davis, a nurse, a man who walked through those hospital corridors every day with a badge that said trusted. He had access to some of the most vulnerable patients, those in recovery, fresh out of surgery, and clinging to life. During critical residency, a fellow nurse described working with Will as constant disruption. I mean, you're there for learning, so he's a little annoying. The instructor would have to stop talking and ask him to be quiet. He also comes off as pretty unprofessional. He pulled a prank by putting laxatives in a fellow nurse's coffee. Not to mention, it's also just a little cruel. Most people that knew Will and his professional career had good things to say about him. His now ex-wife says he wanted to excel in his career, who's always humorous and carefree. He was a seasoned nurse in the hospital CVICU. He was trusted by his colleagues and had years of experience under his belt. June of 2016, the medical team at the heart hospital had just finished another successful surgery. It's just a routine heart procedure. 61-year-old John Lafferty, a retired IRS special agent from the U.S. Treasury. After retirement, John transitioned to farming. He was a man deeply connected to his land and his family. He tended to hay production and just enjoyed the slower pace of life. He was stable post-operation and expected to make a full recovery. His family, feeling reassured, left him in the capable hands of the CVICU staff, confident that he's in a controlled environment designed to monitor patients through the delicate phase of their recovery. Yet, just a few hours later, without warning, his condition deteriorated. His heart rate spiked, his oxygen levels dropped, and within minutes, he was fighting for his life. The medical staff scrambled, doing everything they could to resuscitate him. But it was too late. John suffered a massive stroke-like event and was pronounced dead on June 16, 2017. The cause of death? At the time, it was marked as a medical complication. Perhaps unfortunate, but not unheard of. A consequence of heart surgery. 6 days later, Mr. Sanders, a 61-year-old male patient, experienced an unexplainable incident. He, too, had stroke-like symptoms. July 14, 2017, Gary Parker, only 58 years old. He's now the third patient experiencing stroke-like symptoms. Ronald Clark, stroke-like symptoms and passed away on July 26, 2017. Apparently, these deaths are far enough apart that it's not raising red flags to the hospital just yet. Well, then came August 3rd, 2017. Christopher Greenaway, a 47-year-old man who had worked as a pilot for medical transport, was admitted for coronary artery bypass graft surgery. Chris, a U.S. Army veteran who had served in Iraq, was someone who had faced danger and survived. Now he's just recovering from surgery and looked to be doing well. His wife Donna even recalls kissing him and saying, love you, I'll see you in the morning." The next morning, Chris was scheduled to begin walking around. After all, this is just a preventative surgery, and since he was a younger patient, he was expected to recover without any issues. But in the early hours of August 4th, Chris's nurse, Ben Raspberry, had left a little after 3 a.m. to go get food. He'd asked Will Davis before leaving if he would cover his patients, and Will said, "Yeah, no problem, I've got it." Ben had left his patient stable and recovering with no signs of trouble. Yet, just 20 minutes later, as Ben returns with his Whataburger, he enters the hospital and he heard a voice blaring over the intercom. "Code 44, room 302. Code 44, room 302. His heart dropped. That's Chris's room. Rushing to the scene, Ben found his patient crashing, his heart rate slowing and blood pressure increasing, and his condition deteriorating rapidly. Ben recounted the confusion he felt. "I couldn't believe this happened. I was gone for like 20 minutes. He questioned the nurse who had been keeping an eye on Chris, none other than William Davis, who simply said, I don't know. His blood pressure went high." Despite the best efforts of the medical team, Chris was pronounced brain dead on August 6, 2017, and he had passed away in the evening hours that day. His death, much like Lafferty and Clark before him, remained a mystery. The CT scans of his brain, however, showed something horrifying. air in his cranial cavity, or what's known as an air embolism. It's a very rare complication, so the presence of air in that location is shocking. According to the hospital radiologist, Jose Enriquez, who reviewed the scans, it's something that shouldn't be there. He said, "You knew that something bad had happened." Dr. Turner, who was Chris's doctor, immediately knew something happened with his arterial line. Just a brief explanation: an arterial line is not the same as an IV. IVs are placed in your veins, but arterial lines are placed in an artery so that the medical team can get accurate readings of blood pressure and also withdraw samples to send to the labs. These deaths, they send shockwaves through the hospital. After finding out that Chris had an air embolism, the medical teams who had followed protocols to the letter were left questioning their own abilities. It said the work environment started to change. Everyone became paranoid. The doctors were questioning and wanted to make sure the nurses were doing everything right. Meanwhile, the nurses were questioning and wanting to make sure that the doctors were doing everything right. Everyone was on edge. The hospital decided to actually put up surveillance cameras to get to the bottom of whatever the hell was going on. The turning point came with the case of Joseph Kalina. Joseph had undergone an emergency heart bypass surgery and was recovering in the CVICU. He'd come through the surgery without any complications and was expected to make a full recovery just like everybody else. On January 25th, 2018, Joseph was doing well. His nurse, Natalie, states there was nothing unusual happening that night. She gave him pain meds, and he was even able to eat an apple. She tells him, "I'll come check on you a little later." She's at the medicine machine when she hears Will Davis calling out to her from Joseph's room. Joseph Kalina was deteriorating. He's not awake or responding. Natalie calls the charge nurse to take care of Joseph. They end up intubating and sedating him. In the midst of all the chaos, Will tells Natalie to remove a syringe from the arterial line and cap it. And Natalie, in the moment, doesn't think anything of it. He's more experienced, so she just does as she's told. Mind you, Will is not Joseph Kalina's nurse. In fact, all of Will's patients are on the other side of the unit. Doctors, again, baffled by the sudden unexplained neurological event. Joseph's CT scans revealed the same thing: air in his arterial system. As the deaths mounted, the medical staff began to talk. Whispers are circulating in the break rooms. Hushed conversations take place between doctors and nurses. One nurse mentioned how she felt uneasy about a particular colleague, someone who always just seemed to be around when these deaths occurred. It was just a hunch. It was a gut feeling. But as more people started to share their observations, a name keeps coming up: Will Davis. But some staff members began to wonder if his seemingly helpful nature was hiding something darker. Will had been present during several of the fatal incidents. It wasn't concrete proof, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. Could he have made a mistake? Or was it something worse? Hospital administrators, now alarmed by the growing number of deaths, they begin an internal investigation. They review patient records, recheck surgeries, and analyze timelines. That's when they notice something strange. Many of the patients who died or suffered brain damage had been in the ICU shortly after their surgeries, and many of these patients at some point had been in contact with Will Davis. Still, this isn't enough to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. After all, in the high-stress environment of an ICU, nurses are often present during life or death situations. But the coincidences were becoming too hard to ignore. Will's name appeared again and again in the logs. And in one case, a coworker remembers vividly. Will had entered a patient's room just minutes before they suffered a sudden downturn. This is when the hospital decides to take a closer look. Surveillance footage is revealed. And suddenly, things begin to make sense. What they saw is shocking. In several instances, Will was caught entering patients' rooms, often when no one else is around. Shortly after, the patients start seizing or coding. But what was he doing? It took a medical examiner to finally uncover the truth. It became clear that air had been injected into their arterial lines, causing a fatal air embolism. For those unfamiliar, an air embolism is essentially a bubble of air that enters the bloodstream and travels to the heart, brain, or lungs, and it causes a fatal blockage. It's a painful death, and worst of all, it's nearly impossible to detect unless you're specifically looking for it. And suddenly, the pattern becomes undeniable. Armed with this chilling evidence, Will was swiftly arrested. In the days following, the town of Tyler was in disbelief. How could someone like Will, a nurse, a person meant to care for and heal, be responsible for such horror? Will was charged with multiple counts of capital murder and assault for his crimes. He was also only charged for 4 people's deaths. It's believed that the prosecutors wanted to bring in cases of victims where they had really good, strong evidence against Will. During his trial, prosecutors revealed that Will had intentionally injected air into the arterial lines of at least 7 patients, resulting in death or severe brain damage in 4 of them. He showed no remorse, denying allegations despite the overwhelming evidence. One of the most harrowing moments of the trial is when families of the victims testified, sharing their pain and suffering they endured because of his actions. Courtroom was silent as each story was told, the weight of the loss heavy in the air. As for why Will committed these heinous acts, to this day, no one knows for sure. Some speculate that he was trying to appear like a hero, someone who could save patients after they crashed, which I don't speculate or think that at all, because on the surveillance cameras, patients would crash and he would just be lurking around the corner or standing in the doorway as all the other nurses are trying to rescue these victims. He would just stand there and watch. Others believe it was simply a sick, twisted need for control. He had told his now ex-wife that he was trying to make the patients just stay a little longer. He only wanted to prolong their illness. He was upset with the hospital because they wouldn't let him work overtime. However, this was proved false. The hospital was actually understaffed, and if nurses wanted to work, they weren't denying the help. There's also a show on Hulu called The Lesson is Murder, where an ex-FBI agent, Brianna Fox, she's a professional of criminology at the University of South Florida, and she's working with these students on profiling. So she goes and interviews Will, and she's like, is there anything else that you want to get off your chest or, just talk about? And during this interview, it's where he admits to killing a 96-year-old woman in 2016. He explains it as if she's on her deathbed, she's a DNR, and it's so hard to watch her suffering. And him murdering her was like opening a door that shouldn't have been open, like Pandora's sinister box. Anyways, if you want to check out more or, I don't know, sometimes if you're like me, like I will watch something or listen to something about true crime, a specific case, and it's just not enough. I feel like I need more. And so If you feel like you need more after today, that's also a good one to check out. It's also just kind of a different and interesting show. Whatever his motive was, the jury only deliberated for an hour and found him guilty. He was sentenced to death for his crimes, and he still sits on death row in Texas. I also just kind of wanted to put the timeline more in perspective and go over the victims and the dates that they died. So first, at some point in 2016, the 96-year-old woman. June 16th, 2017, John LaFerty. June 22nd, Mr. Sanders. July 14th, Gary Parker. July 26th, Ronald Clark. August 6th, Christopher Greenaway. August 7th, James Wages. October 16th, Jesus Serrano. October 26th, Ricky Glenn. November 30th, Pamela Henderson. January 24th, 2018, Joseph Klina. Jesus Serrano did actually survive, but he now needs assistance with basic everyday tasks. He too was injected with air, and he had gone into a coma. His family was told that he would likely not survive. But Jesus did wake up, and his daughter stated in court that she feels like she had been mourning her dad for 3 years. He wasn't the same person. He's just in a body that doesn't smile, laugh, call, or talk to her. It's incredibly heartbreaking. And there you have it, the disturbing case of William George Davis, the nurse who turned the ICU into his own personal hunting ground. A man who was supposed to be a healer, but instead left a trail of death. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think drove Will to commit these horrible acts? Comment below and let's talk about it. I actually have a really hard time trying to figure out his motive. It's not like I am a professional or anything, but most times serial killers have a really rough childhood, or there's something very traumatic that happens to them in adolescence. But Will's childhood was relatively normal. The only thing maybe slightly abnormal was that his father could be controlling. But I thought it was also interesting, and I wanted to note that when Will was in a relationship at 16 or 17, he became very controlling of a girlfriend. He allegedly told her he was going to drive his car into her house after she attempts to leave him. But instead, he ends up crashing into the tree in front of the house, which thankfully he did, because had that tree not been there, he would have drove straight into that girl's room. And that's all I have for now. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and please feel free to comment, like, share with a friend, leave a review. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.